This Word 365 demonstration was recorded as part of the Creating Accessible Content with Office 365 webinar. So in this next demo, I'm going to show you how we make this employer perspectives on employment of people with disabilities document accessible. Before we do jump in, I do want to mention that if you're using older versions of Office 2013, 2016, anything other than Office 365, what you see in the features will be different, although the best practices that we talk about and the approaches are very similar, and they are maintained across those versions of Office. I also wanted to mention that while I'm going to be using a mouse, there are keyboard shortcuts for all of the Office applications. There's quite a few. So anybody who does edit documents using the keyboard, whether you're using a screen reader or that's just your preference, there are a whole lot of those to jump into. I'm not going to get into those today, but we will provide a link to Microsoft's list of those shortcuts in the resources for this training, which we'll put a link to. There is a link in the chat, and I will repeat that link at the end so that you can go and take a look at that. So this particular document, employer perspectives on employees with disabilities, this is based on data from the United States Department of Labor. They did a survey of employers and got their perspectives on people with disabilities. And I did want to say that I've intentionally made this inaccessible for demonstration purposes, so their content was accessible. So one of the first things that I like to do when I start a document is to make sure that it gets a proper title. So one of the things that I'm going to do is copy the title off screen here. But the way that you do that in Word is you go over to File and click on Info, and you'll see a whole lot of properties for your document. But the one that we're interested in is this one right here, the properties, and there's a drop down, and we've got an advanced properties option. So I'm going to go to that, and that actually opens up a dialog that is, it's actually a Windows dialog, but it has properties for the document: title, subject, author, manager, company, category. There's a whole lot of stuff on there. The one I want to make sure that I put in here is the one I copied off screen, which is the actual name of this document: Employer Perspectives on Employment of People with Disabilities. So there's two reasons why we want to do that. One is that screen readers can pick up on the document title, and it oftentimes will provide a more meaningful description of what's in the document than the file name. So the other reason is if you use any kind of content management tool like SharePoint or WordPress or anything on the web that you're going to house this document that you're making on, it oftentimes will also pick up on the properties here. So you may actually want to fill out the subject, the author, the company, and keywords, because search engines can pick up on that. SharePoint can pick up on that. So, and I guess there's actually a third reason, which is that if you export this to PDF, it's going to be looking for this title and display that in the Adobe Reader. And that is something that the screen reader will pick up on. So it just gives us a better description of what's in the document. So for this demo, I'm just going to put in the title. I'm going to ignore the other fields on here, and I'll go to OK. So having set that, that's the first thing I'll do when I'm making pretty much any document. And then the next thing I like to do is to open up the accessibility checker. So this document, since it's already written, we're going to see any errors that the accessibility checker finds. So the way that you do that is there's a couple of ways, but the one that I like to do is go over here to the Review tab. And then there's a Check Accessibility option on the ribbon. And I'm just going to go ahead and go to Check Accessibility. Now that does open up a new pane on the right-hand side. And you can tab over to this if you are using the keyboard or a screen reader to edit this document. But the accessibility checker, it's really robust. It checks a lot of things. It's made a lot of progress in the last 5 years. But it provides both errors and warnings and guidance on things that you can do to make your document more accessible. And I will say from experience that if you can get this to have nothing in it, so the accessibility is good to go, then your document will read very well with any of the major screen reading technology. And likewise, if you choose to export a PDF of your document, it will maintain that accessibility when you export it. So one of the things that I like to do while I'm writing a document, this one's already written, but if you're writing it, is to keep the accessibility checker running while I work. And they have a checkbox in this accessibility pane that you can check to turn that on. And what that does is it will actually continually run the accessibility checker in the background as you type. And down here in the status bar, if there's a problem, it'll just say accessibility investigate. And so I'm going to close this accessibility pane. And if you look down here, or if you tab down here, if you're using a screen reader or keyboard commands, you can see that the accessibility says investigate, and that's your key that there's something going wrong. So I'm going to go to this. You can click on that or activate it with your keyboard commands, and that again will open up the accessibility checker. And if we cleared all of these, it would say accessibility is good to go. So that's what you want to see before you distribute your document. So looking at some of these errors that the accessibility checker is displaying now for this document, we've got missing alternative text. So that would be any images that or graphics or diagrams that don't have alternative text associated them. This no header row, it's the second one listed here. That's in reference to tables, and there's a table in this document, and we'll talk about that. Images not being inline is the next thing it's got. We'll talk more about that with images. Those are the errors it's found, so you definitely want to make sure that any errors in here are corrected. Warnings, again, I mean, those are things that it's found that may or may not be problems. The one that's displayed here says merged or split cells in a table. We'll talk about tables in a moment, but there are circumstances where some of these warnings may not apply to your content. So it's a good idea to look and see what they are, and if you can fix them, great, but it's not necessarily a hard set rule. I'm going to go to this warning that says merged or split cells, just to show you that if you click on one of the warnings or one of the errors, it will take you to that spot in the document. So in this case, it's taking me to the table where this warning applies. But the main thing I wanted to show you is that the accessibility checker in Office 365 now also provides some additional information. It tells you why you would want to fix it. So in this case, it says tables should have a simple structure. So if you've got a merged cell, maybe that makes the structure difficult to read. And they even provide steps to fix it. So, if you finish this training and forget what the steps are, then, you can follow the steps here. And they even provide a link to Microsoft's site at the bottom that says, read more about making documents accessible. So, Microsoft is a good resource for their products. They do a lot of accessibility work, and they do have content out on the web. So one of the basic things that we need to do to documents to make them accessible is to provide some structure to the document. So structure allows screen readers to navigate the document in a more usable way. So it also allows anybody to apply styles to text, which can quickly change things like colors or alignment. It also allows us to do things like embed a table of contents and navigate the document quickly by following links to our document structure. So all of the styles appear on the Home tab, so I'm going to navigate to that. And there's a styles grouping on the Home tab. And again, if you are using keyboards, you can get to all of the ribbon commands, including the styles, and that allows us to change the styles. So the main thing for navigation in documents, particularly Word documents, is to add headings. So I can select some text here. I'm going to select this this first row here, which is really our title that says Employer Perspectives on Employment of People with Disabilities. Now, if I do navigate through my headings, I can see that there is a title style. Now, previous guidance would say, well, select the title style within Word, but I'm going to caution you to not do that, because if you do decide to export out to PDF, that title style isn't picked up as a navigational element. So the best choice that I would recommend is setting this as your first heading in the document. So I'm going to go ahead and select heading level 1 from the styles here. Now, we aren't seeing on this screen that I'm showing what that has actually done. So I am going to go up to the View tab, and we have something called the navigation pane. That's in a group called Show. So I can show ruler, grid lines, or navigation pane, and I'm going to check that box for navigation pane. And it does open over here on the left. You can navigate to it with keyboard commands as well. And you'll see now that my heading level 1, employer perspectives on employment of people with disabilities, now shows in the headings. And that's the start of our ability to navigate this by adding in some of these styles. And it creates a hierarchy. So if I make heading level 2, for example, my next paragraph starts with the word overview, and it's going to provide an overview of this document. If I go back to my home tab and I select a heading level 2 style, over in the navigation pane, it's made a level 2 heading, which is indented slightly. And navigationally for screen readers, we can navigate by heading. So there's actually hotkeys in, I think all the major screen readers have this ability to navigate by heading. We can also view a list of headings. So you can get a whole list of headings in the document, kind of like a table of contents, and navigate that way. And that's a function of the screen reader. But as I said, most of the big screeners, JAWS, NVDA, even Windows Narrator, can display a list of headings in your document. So it's always a good idea to add the headings in there and to make sure that they are intuitive and in the order that you intend them to be read. So that would mean things like not skipping a heading level, for example. You can go to heading level 1. The next time you see a heading, you'd expect it to either be a heading level 1 for a completely new section of the document, or a heading level 2, which would be a new section, falling under heading level 1. So if you are using a mouse, one of the things that you can do, I'm going to close the accessibility checker here just to give myself a little more space. But I've got a heading here called Major Industry Sectors. That falls under the overview. So I want that to actually be a heading level 3. So I've got heading level 1 as my title, heading level 2 as my overview section, and then this subsection would be Major Industry Sectors. So an easy way to select that would be click on the line off to the side in the margin, and that'll actually select the whole line. Again, you could do this with the keyboard, but you'd have to hold down Shift and select. Now I can do that with multiple things. So if, for example, I scroll down a bit and I've got employer concerns as another section of this document, if that was on the same level, in this case level 3, I could hold down Control and click in the margin next to it, and now I'm going to have selected both of those 2 headings. In this case right now, I just really want this major industry sectors to be heading level 3, so I'm going to select only that and heading level 3. And again, over on the navigation pane, we now have a heading level 3. So we've got the title, employer perspectives, we've got the overview section, and then a subsection underneath that, major industry sectors. So again, that just allows everybody to navigate the document in a more expedient way and provide some structure to it. And I will say that when you export to PDF, if you choose to do that, you can use these headings to create bookmarks in the PDF. So it gives you that kind of nice table of contents bookmark structure in PDFs as well. So that's probably the #1 best practice for accessibility, particularly in Word, but in Office applications, is to add headings in there. And you want to make sure that you're using, these built-in styles for the various heading levels, because that's going to give you the most accessible experience. Some other styles that you can apply include things like lists. I do have a list here in the middle under major industry sectors, and it's just listing the sectors. Now, this particular list is split off into 2 columns, and that's okay as long as we're using the column formatting. So I think most of us are familiar with creating lists, but again, the best way to do it, instead of typing a bullet character or like a greater than character or something like that, is to actually navigate up to your home tab and your paragraph settings and choose the list. It is actually a style, so if you were to look at the styles grouping here again on the home tab, there is a list paragraph style, and that can be applied as well. So there are a number of other styles you could put in here. The headings are the main one for accessibility. List, again, also a good one. Some of the other styles are more visual formatting. I mean, you're welcome to use those, but I would definitely recommend that if you're conveying information by a visual change, that you have that written out in some other way so that people know. Oftentimes, if you've bolded content or made it in italics, and that's to set it off in some way, it might actually be better to make a new heading, maybe a lower level than what you're currently using, so that it sets it off structurally for screen readers and also in the navigation and table of contents. So I'm going to go back to the accessibility checker and take a look at some of the other areas there. So to do that, again, I can either go to Review and click on Check Accessibility, which opens the accessibility pane on the right-hand side, or if you do have that checkbox to keep accessibility checker running, it'll have this in the status bar at the bottom of the page. It'll have an accessibility you can click on. So I see that I have an error that says I'm missing alternative text. I can expand that and see that there are a couple pictures here that simply don't have alt text. Again, you can navigate to that clicking on it or navigating to it with the keyboard. So I got picture 11 here. I'm just going to click on that, and it's going to scroll my document to that location where the picture is missing alt text. So in this case, it's a picture of someone using a Braille keyboard, and it's included in this because a Braille keyboard might be an accommodation that an employer would provide. And this paragraph says for accommodations requiring a cost, the typical one-time expenditure was $500. So something like a Braille keyboard may even be less than that. So oftentimes, we're trying to highlight in this particular document that, reasonable accommodations and assistive technology can be actually fairly inexpensive. So we want to put our alt text on there that tells us that why this image was included in there. So I actually have on my other screen some alt text typed out here. I'm just going to copy and paste that and show how we can put that alt text in there. So I need to open up the context menu. I mean, typically with the mouse, you'd right click on that. And I do get an option to edit alt text. And again, this can be navigated with the keyboard as well. So if I go to edit alt text, in my right pane here, I get the alt text options. And I'm going to paste what I had written off screen. And in this case, I've got a businessman typing on a Braille computer keyboard, which is an example of an inexpensive assistive technology. This photo was provided as an openly licensed photo, but they did require that we provide attribution for that. So I have in the photo, it's got a caption that says photo by Renee Wan, but that is not going to be read by the screen reader because it's actually part of the photo. So I actually have in the alt text photo by Renee Wan as well. So that's the alt text for that image, and that's how you would do it. I am going to close out of this alt text pane, And we can, again, go back to our accessibility checker, and the error that was showing up for picture 9 is now gone. So I can go on to my next picture. And in this case, it's a security warning. So this is accompanying the paragraph that says, for copies of survey reports referred to in this document, please visit the Department of Labor website. If the following warning dialog appears, go to the Show All Content button. And then we've got a picture of that dialog. Now, we haven't given the information in the dialog in the main body of the text. So that's something that we'll want to make sure to do in the alt text. Below that, I've actually got a screenshot of the Department of Labor Research website. So this is a good time to talk about how we might want to group these two graphics, because they kind of go together. If you go to the website, you might see this warning message. So it doesn't actually need to be two separate images per se. So one of the things, if you want to group content, is that you need to actually make sure that the alignment of the content is not in line with the text. So this is the text wrapping choice. In line with the text is actually what we need for accessibility, because if the image isn't in line with the text, a screen reader would not necessarily know what the logical reading order of that image would be. So we do want to end up with in line with the text, but Word does require us to take it out of inline, at least temporarily, so we can group these things. So I tend to like to use either top and bottom or square alignment because it doesn't throw off the layout too much. So I'm actually going to select my warning dialog here. It does say only secure content is displayed. What's the risk? Show all content. Now this is kind of a legacy thing. Their website doesn't actually say this anymore, but this is for demonstration purposes. All right, I can, again, if you're using a mouse, you can hover over the image and you do get the layout options as kind of a pop-up. You can also get there via the context menus if you're using a keyboard. So I'm going to actually just click on that and I'm going to choose top and bottom. It changes my layout ever so slightly by adding a little bit of space at the bottom. I'm going to do the same for the screenshot below it. That's just the Department of Labor's research website. So top and bottom on that. So now it actually allows me to select both of these images at the same time, and I can hold down Control and click on those to do that. And I do now get a picture format tab at the top in the ribbon bar, and I'm going to click on that. And I do have some options here. One of them is grouping. Since my screen is so small, it doesn't actually spell out the word group. If you have a larger screen resolution, it will. But there is a button there for it. I'm going to click on that and go to group. And now they are grouped together. So I can move those around how I like. You know, I might want to have the screenshot warning on top of it. Their picture format does have some options for adjusting the layering of these things. I'm just going to go to the bring forward option and bring it to the front. So now what we're seeing is the Department of Research website screenshot behind the warning dialog that it might display. Now, one thing that we do need to do is, if you're going to group images in Word like this, and this would go for smart graphics and things like that that you make in Word, if you group them and you later want to export to PDF, then it's going to expect all of the things in that group to be decorative, and then the alt text should be on the group itself. So I want to actually do that. I'm going to right click and go to Edit Alt Text. And just as before, we see where we could type in text, but I can mark it as decorative. There's a checkbox for that in the alt text pane. I'm going to check that for the screenshot. I'm also going to click on the warning dialog and mark it as decorative. So I'm good on that. And then the last thing I need to do is make my group inline again. So I'm going to select that and I'm going to choose inline with text, which now the screen reader will know when it gets to that point in the text, it's going to read the alt text as if it were part of that paragraph. And then the last thing we would do is actually add alt text. Again, I can right click on it and go to Edit Alt Text. So I do have a pre-written alt text. I'm going to copy that off screen, and then I'm going to go ahead and paste that in here. So this is what I've got. I've got a thumbnail of the Department of Labor Research website with a superimposed warning dialog that reads, unless your content is displayed, this dialog has a link that reads, what's the risk? And a show all content button. We do want to make sure that the alt text isn't too terribly long. So if it were something much longer than this, I would want to put that perhaps as a caption in the main text or as part of the paragraph. But you know, a couple of sentences is okay, and we should be good there. So I'm going to go back to the accessibility checker here. And we'll note that the alt text errors that we were receiving are now gone. We do have some image and objects not in line, so I can click on those. The image of a woman using video conference relay. I'm going to right click on that. It's complaining it's not in line. So the wrap text option in this case, in the context menu, I'll just say inline with text, takes care of that error message. Same thing with this photo 10 here. I can do the same and make it inline. And if we look again in our accessibility pane, we'll note that it's now cleared up those errors. So the last thing in here is tables, and in our accessibility checker, I do see that my table has an error. It says there's no header row. I'm going to click on the table. Again, you can navigate there with the keys, and we see that it looks like there's a header on here, but it's saying that structurally it doesn't have one. So, and it's also complaining that, or throwing a warning that there's merged cells. Now this table shows us strategies that employers have used for hiring and recruiting people with disabilities. It's got a strategy in one column, a percent in a second column, and a rank in a third column. So that's this fairly structured data table. It's just 3 columns and several rows, and that's preferred for screen readers because screen readers can navigate, they have special commands that can navigate rows and columns in a table. So we want to make sure that we provide this structure for our table, and it also can pick up on the header row, which is what allows it to identify the header when you're farther down in the table. So if I navigate down in this table, I see postings of disability related publications as a strategy. Well, I may not know that that's a strategy if I don't have the heading selected. So what I'm going to do is actually just copy this top row and cut it out. And I'm going to paste it right above the table instead. And then I'm actually going to go to my table layout here. It's a group, or rather it's a tab up in the ribbon bar, and I can delete this top row. And once I do that, you can see that in the accessibility pane, the error with the table has now gone away. It's okay if you do have some merged cells so long as the table structure is still clear. You know, that's a judgment call. I know that JAWS, for example, can read merged cells, but it's something to be aware of that, you know, can trip up screen readers. So the last thing I did want to show is that the accessibility checker now has a way to check color contrast. So I'm going to highlight the title of this table that I've copied out of the first row. It says ways to recruit talented workers with disabilities. It's kind of like a light blue. I'm going to actually make it even lighter color. Maybe we'll pick like a light red. And as soon as I do that, I do in the accessibility checker get a warning that the contrast is hard to read. So that's going to depend on the size of the text you selected. Smaller text requires a higher contrast. But if you do get this warning, then you can go and try a different color. You know, if it's a light color background, going darker would be a good way to get rid of that. So I'm going to go ahead and change its color to something darker, like a dark red. We'll note that that color contrast warning has now gone. One last thing I want to leave you with is hypertext in terms of Word documents, or hyperlinks, I should say. Links in general, the current best practice is if a link is short, then it's okay to put in a full web address. But if you think of things like a link to an Amazon product or a link on SharePoint, those links can be rather lengthy and have a lot of ID codes and that kind of stuff in them. That can be very tedious if you're listening to a screen reader read that out. So in that case, the best practice would be to give it a more meaningful link. So in the example of this document, I'm going to scroll up. We have here more information about low-cost, high-impact accommodations can be found on the GEN website at http://askgen.org media low-cost, high-impact.html. That's a lot to read for a screen reader, and it just makes the document look cleaner if we actually make the link text say GEN website. So I'm going to highlight that. I'm going to right click and edit the hyperlink, and on the text to display I'm going to paste GEN website and change my paragraph a little bit so that it now reads more information about low-cost, high-impact accommodations can be found on the GEN website. So we don't have that whole link in there, but it does tell the user where they're going to be led if they follow that link. And so to export, we've cleared all of our accessibility issues in this document. The accessibility checker reports nothing. So if I export this to PDF, it will be accessible as well. So to do that, I can go to File and Save As. And in this case, some of you who do have Acrobat might actually have the Save as Adobe PDF. I don't actually want to do that in this case. I want to use Office's own export feature. So I'm going to choose PDF from my file type here. It says, where do you want to save it and what do you want to save it as? I do have a more options link under here. I do want to click that quickly because there are some options that you can take a look at. All right, so now you can see this save as dialog. I've got some options here. There's a button that says options. I'm going to click on that, and that's what I want to focus on. The one thing you want to make sure that you check is it says include non-printing information, create bookmarks using headings. I want to check that box because that's going to give me my kind of table of contents bookmarks in the PDF file based on the headings that we've established in the document. We also want to include document properties. I'll check that, and document structure tags for accessibility. That's what puts those tags into the PDF file that allows the screen reader to navigate it. And that's pretty much it. You can go to OK and then hit save. I'm going to cancel that out because I don't need to save it now, but that will generate your PDF file. And again, if it's accessible in Word based on the accessibility checker, you should get an accessible PDF file on the export as well. This concludes the Word 365 demonstration for creating accessible content with Office 365. The presentation, as well as the questions and answers segment, will be provided as separate videos. Thank you for watching.